The first thing that we have to do with this question is we have to figure out which chapter it's from. So I'm going to work things this way. First of all, I know that there is only one sample being taken. It mentions that, what does it say in the question? It says that Brandon took a sample of 29 customers. So I have n equals to 29. That's my sample size. Now, one sample automatically is going to mean one population. So how does this help me? Well, knowing that I have one population means that it's either going to be a chapter 10 question, or a chapter 11 question, or a chapter 12 question. Anything from chapters 13 and 14, and for the most part even 15, that would be dealing with more than one population. So we have only one population. So I know that so far I've narrowed it down to these 3 chapters. So this is the first piece of information that I'm going to make use of. After this, I need to determine what type of data. So my data that has been collected is either going to be nominal data, or my data is going to be interval data. Now these are terms that were introduced really early on in the course. I think it was chapter 2. Nominal data just means that you are checking to see which categories people fit into. So if I was to take a survey and ask people what's your favorite color, people might choose red or green or blue and so on. So that would be nominal data that I'm collecting. But if I'm dealing with collecting data where it's numerical data, the best way to think about this is either some sort of measures or counts. So if you're measuring or counting anything and you're getting numerical responses in your survey, that means that you've collected interval data. So in this question, the 29 customers are giving the amounts that their bills are. So they're recording, this has to do with sales, and it has to do with a dollar store owner. So when they're talking about bills, they're talking about how much they spent in the store. So I know that I'm dealing with interval data here. Now, this process that I'm going through, having a look at whether or not I have one population and whether or not I have interval data, what this is doing is I'm basically following through the flow chart. Your professor probably gave you a flow chart that keeps track of all of the different formulas that happen after and including chapter 11. If not, you can find it in your textbook. I think it takes place either at the end of chapter 13 or somewhere in the appendix of the textbook, but I'll try and put something up afterwards. Basically, by determining how many populations and what type of data, and small, simple questions like this, you can determine exactly which formula you're supposed to be working with. So that's why I'm going through this process here. How many populations, what type of data. And you'll see on the flowchart that after you get down to the point where you've got one population and it's interval data, the next thing that you'll encounter is basically what the focus of the question is. Now, they don't call it that on the flowchart, but you'll see that the focus of the question has really 2 choices. You're either focused on the mean, or you're focused on the variance. And when I say what we're focused on, what I mean is the mean the unknown quantity that we're trying to determine, or is the variance the unknown quantity that we're trying to determine? So in our case, really it comes down to having a look at the wording of the question. In part 1, they talk about determining whether or not the advertising campaign was successful. Now, anybody who runs an advertising campaign and puts money into that advertising campaign is not going to be interested in they're not going to be interested in changing how much variation their customers have in their spending. Instead, they're going to want to increase customer spending. And so we would say that they want the average amount that the customer spends to go up. So it's the mean that I'm focused on in this question. So this leaves one final piece of the puzzle to be determined before we can decide which which sort of which technique or which formula we're going to use. And finally, it works like this. We simply have to know whether or not the population standard deviation was given. If the answer to that is yes, and it will be yes in our question because they told us that the population standard deviation is $4.01. If the answer is yes, that means that we're dealing with the Z statistic. So this is going to be a Z test, or it could be a Z estimate, but I'll show you later on that this is going to be a hypothesis test. So it's a Z test of the population mean. This is going to be the right choice in our case, whereas it could have been that we didn't have the population standard deviation. It could have been that we weren't told that in the population the standard deviation was $4.01. So then that would mean that I would be doing the t-test of a population mean. But that's not going to be the case. Instead, we were given the standard deviation of the population, and it's very important that it's the population standard deviation. So the z-test of one population mean is my choice. So that's how I'm going to solve this question. What does that z-test look like? Well, here's the basic formula. And you'll be able to find this formula with the attached files. So I've got my sample mean, and the sample mean we're going to be figuring out from the data in the Excel file. There is the population mean, which we were given. They told us that the population mean was equals to $18.20. We also have, and this is why we needed the population standard deviation. So I'll just call it st dot deviation. And then finally my sample size. So we pretty much have everything that's needed for this formula. The only thing that we're going to have to figure out at all is our sample mean, and we're going to be able to do that from the Excel data. But everything else was given to us. The population mean was given in the setup of the question. The sample size, that's 29 people were surveyed. The population standard deviation, that was also given. So like I said, this is going to be a fairly straightforward question. There are, however, going to be a few little problems that you might not be thinking about. I'll do that at the very end. There's going to be some required conditions that it's really important that we check. Otherwise, you won't get full marks for this question. But this is the actual test. This is the Z test that we're going to use to solve our problem.